next speaker, that's Rodney Leon, an architect who I've had the pleasure to work with. I consider him a friend, and our offices are, within 5 or 6 blocks of each other in Manhattan, and we work together on a few projects. But what has always impressed me about him is his research-oriented approach, especially when it comes to, history as it connects to the African American experience, right? And he is the architect of the Arc of Return in the United Nations Plaza, as also the African burial ground near Wall Street. So it is my Leon, architect.
Hey,
Well,
Ave, how are you?
how you doing?
Good. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, man. Good to see you too. Even if it's on Zoom, it's good to see you. Yeah. You know,
Yeah. Thank you so
how's
much
how's
for inviting me to participate this morning.
Sure. Can you speak up a little bit, Ronnie? Your voice is just a little soft.
All right. So I'm using a phone for my connection because I'm a little bit. I'm out in Long Island, way near the end,
Hmm.
Sag Harbor, so the connection's not the greatest. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you okay now.
Okay. Okay. Great. Yeah. So I I guess it's interesting that you asked me to speak for a few minutes this morning. And I'm glad you do that because a lot of times over the last year or so, I have had the opportunity to talk about some of our work and to take that opportunity to actually recenter and think about some of the things that are more important and establishing that big picture, right? In these dark times, it's often difficult. People are struggling day to day just to be able to survive. And now, it gives us an opportunity to prioritize and figure out, why we're really here with this limited time and on Earth. And we're actually living history right now. And I know sometimes, it takes this kind of like a shock for us to be able to start to think about, who we are, why we're here, and how we can contribute to life, not just for ourselves but for others around us.
Right.
So I think most of us are probably experiencing similar things, but it's through, I guess, the work that I've been doing that I think that I find myself under the auspices of the memorialization and commemoration of the ancestors that I find myself most appreciative that I've had that opportunity. So thank you for giving me a chance to kind of think about that again and to talk about that with the group on this morning on your Zoom Zestival.
Pleasure, Rodney. It's a pleasure to have you. It's a pleasure to know you. It's a pleasure to, be able to enjoy your work around the city and around the world. So I would love to know more about your journey, from, the time of the African burial ground. We had one of your mentees as a speaker on our show a few months ago. And she mentioned that she worked with you on the African burial ground when you were, putting the project together when you won the competition. And I know there was this big connection with honoring the ancestors. So, love to hear more from you on what that meant, how it translated into architecture, and your life.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, for those of us that are not familiar as much about the African Burial Ground, it's a national monument that's located in Lower Manhattan that was accidentally discovered in the early 90s during the construction of a federal office tower on 290 Broadway near Foley Square, right behind City Hall. And I had heard about it when I was an architecture student at the time.
Mm.
And in my architectural studies at Pratt, most of what we're focused on at that time were issues of modernism, issues of postmodernism. That debate was on top of everybody's list in terms of the controversies and the challenges of design in the city at the time. And I was looking, I think, for something more as a person of African descent in terms of a language that could be used in the future in my own practice to communicate my own culture and my own history, which I did not see necessarily through the lens of modernism. Mm. So I was looking for a way to contextualize modernism, and that really led me to, I think, a deeper interest in history and in culture, and to use history and culture as intangible contextual elements to help define space and define architecture, and to develop a language that was more connected and rooted in my own experience as a person of color, person of African descent, a person of Haitian descent in America, where the modern language spoke of a kind of like a universal language, but it was a universal language that obviously came out of, Austria and Germany, and was meant to be, in a lot of ways, superimposed in its abstraction. I think it loses, in some ways, its connections to the local, the historic, the cultural, and needed to be mediated and contextualized with culture, with spirit, with experience, so that it had meaning, not just for those who were superimposing it oftentimes, but for those who were receiving and those who were experiencing and those who were going to be connecting with that architecture. So I think in the African burial ground, it gave me an opportunity to really delve deeper into the history of people of African descent in this hemisphere, and our roles in building and developing what we consider to be, the United States, or quote unquote the Western Hemisphere, Western civilization here, and it gave us an opportunity to it gave me an opportunity to be able to not to learn, but then also to be able to apply certain contextual elements to the language and express a history and a truth that was, I believe, hidden. And an architecture and a place that was hidden for many, many years. For over a century, the burial ground was hidden. People didn't really recognize it as a place or a space. We just went about our business in Lower Manhattan and other places, not understanding that we're, these buildings, City Hall, the Foley Square, the courthouses, were all built upon this 18th century burial ground where an estimated 15 to 20,000 people are buried. And it's a larger metaphor or a larger story that is something that is reflective of what has happened, not only in the burial ground, where, we have this amazing, powerful narrative of the United States and the Western civilization, but what's missing and what's been hidden from that story has been, the sacrifices of diverse communities, whether they were indigenous or whether they were women or whether they were people of African descent, and their roles in actually building this country and building civilization. And now we're at a time, interestingly enough, that was driven by this pandemic, I think, in large extent, where people have taken an opportunity to stop and to pause and to not necessarily have to deal with kind of day-to-day distractions that we had to deal with typically, and begin to ask questions about why things are. And, people are, I think a large part of the catalyst, of course, was the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And all of a sudden, people were watching this tragic event happen. We're all locked up for the most part, in our isolation bubbles, and all of a sudden people started to say to themselves, well, why did that happen to this person?
Right.
Why? And start asking questions like, why do we need the police to do the things that they're doing and to serve the role that they're playing?
Right.
Why does this keep happening? People began to ask other questions as well about, why, people were asking like, why am I paying, hundreds of thousands of dollars for college tuition where other people aren't? Why don't I have the health care that I need to have? So, I think that this is a time where people are beginning to awaken to certain things.
Yeah.
And certain truths and certain things that have been healed that haven't been able to be discussed are now seriously being considered and seriously being discussed in different aspects of our society. And I think it's a transformative time.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that experience of the burial ground was literal design competition and the construction and even everything that's happened after it. It's a metaphor for what's happening around the world in a lot of ways. These hidden truths, these hidden histories, the impact of cultures that have been for so long undervalued, and people that have been undervalued are now, we're in a discussion about recontextualizing our history,
right,
and providing spaces and places of equity. You're going to hear that a lot now: equity, diversity, inclusion in our offices, our schools, our education system, and now even in architecture, our architectural discourse,
right,
both on the academic world as well as in the professional world. And I think it's amazing because the process of designing and memorialization for me is about this search for myself, and using memorials, which are public spaces, as an opportunity to contextualize history in a way that it hasn't been contextualized.
It's beautiful, yeah.
And to contextualize culture that way as well.
Yeah, beautiful. I believe you also have some slides that we can share here, right?
Go to the first slide.
And towards the end of it, definitely tell us about your trip to Senegal and, Gate of No Return and Goree Island, etc.
Absolutely. This is a slide. It has the 4 lines that state, for all those who are lost, for all those who are stolen, for all those who are left behind, and for all those who are not forgotten. This is engraved on the north wall facing Duane Street on the chamber of the African Burial Ground Monument. We call the wall that has been engraved on the Wall of Remembrance. And adjacent to that Wall of Remembrance engraving is that Sankofa symbol, which is that heart-shaped symbol coming from the Adinkra people of West Africa, where is currently the modern state of Ghana and the Ivory Coast. And that symbol was found in the form of, I think, the remnants of some beads on the remains of one of the bodies that was uncovered in the site during the archaeological excavation. So it's believed that that particular individual, and maybe others, came from that part of West Africa, that Adinkra culture. But I think even more significantly, the Sankofa symbol means loosely to go back to the past and retrieve one's knowledge or one's history in order to move forward into the future. And it became, for us and for myself, I think a reflective and powerful icon for the meaning behind memorialization, and this memorial in particular. But this idea of remembrance and this idea of loss and this idea of utilizing one's history and one's past as a mechanism in order for us to understand who we are, and also to allow us to get the strength from those that came before us in order to move forward into the future. Beautiful. So that element, and the second element, which you see are these mounds that are adjacent to the plaza you walk into, are ways of contextualizing the location of the reinterment of the 419 remains that were uncovered during the archaeological excavation and placed them in the site into a sacred zone, which is what we call the ancestral reinterment zone. So you can see like those mounds, those 7 mounds, which we designed with the help of our landscape architect, Elizabeth Kennedy, who I'm sure you know very well.
Yes.
We were looking for a way to reveal the reinterment and reveal the sacred nature of that part of the site. So those mounds, which have a historical precedence to funerary mounds, to grave mounds, are markers that identify that element of the site as that sacred ancestral reinterment zone. And that will continue to reveal the fact that, you know, there are those remains in that particular area. And there's a way of sculpting landscapes that is, I think, universal in terms of human history, in terms of ways that we want to be able to remember or mark the ground that from where we came, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, to mark it in a way so that it becomes a kind of like a sacred space as well, to complement what's happening on the site.
Right.
Another way of revealing is this third element, which is on the southern wall, is this memorial wall map. And in this memorial wall map, what we've done is superimpose the 20th century grid of Lower Manhattan with a sandblasted gray area that indicates the boundaries of what is known to be underneath all of these streets and all of these buildings, the 18th century African Burial Ground National Monument.
You're talking
Now,
about, sorry, you're talking about a huge swath of land which was an African burial ground. I mean, we know this neighborhood.
Yeah. So the
that-
actual burial, yes, exactly. The actual burial ground itself extends significantly from Broadway to that vertical street, all the way to the left, to the west, all the way underneath the courthouse, which is now, I believe, the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse, under Fold Square. So it's about like a 4 to 6 acre swath of land underneath city, you know, where City Hall is, where 290 Broadway is, and the memorial site is about a 1/4 acre site on the corner. So, you know, that is a hidden reality of how Lower Manhattan came to be. It's literally built on the bodies of the enslaved Africans that came here to work. And a little known fact that needs to be understood is that, you know, New York City at one point had the largest slaveholding population in all of the colony, even more than Charleston, South Carolina. So it basically lets us know that, you know, slavery was not a Southern institution; it was an American institution. And in the North, we had just as many, if not more, this impact on the lives of people through slavery than in any other part of the country. Right. So this map kind of talks about the scale of that space relative to Lower Manhattan. Right. Next slide.
And you know what I find really interesting is that, I mean, it's obvious why they would do that, but that the city at that time ended at Wall Street. That's why it was called Wall Street, because there was a wall there. But the African burial ground is many blocks north of that. You know, so they were working to build that area, but they were buried outside, you know, which tells a lot about the sociological, you know, aspect of what happened over those 400 years of atrocities. I just wanted to add that because you know, I was looking at the map, and it just boom pops out at you that, you know, it wasn't downtown as it was called at that time. I mean, at the downtown for Wall Street was more, let's see if we can push it away as much as we can. Yeah.
So basically, when the British took over New Amsterdam from the Dutch, that location where it's currently Duane Street, which was near Chambers Street, was the northernmost boundary of New York City. And the English did not allow people of African descent to bury their dead within the boundaries of the city anymore. So that's why that area became essentially the burial ground itself, because that was the northernmost boundary of New York City at that time. And African people began burying their dead just north of that fence line. This is
Wait, this
slide.
is Idris Elba in the new James Bond movie, right? This photo.
That would be great, actually. I'd like to see that.
Hey, just very quickly, we are on time, and I just wanted to ask the audience that we had 10 minutes left for open mic, but his topic is so interesting. I hope all of you are okay with us going into the Q&A. And if you have any questions, please put it on the chat. So back to you, Rodney. If they have any questions, we'll see it on the chat. Back to you, Rodney.
Thanks, bro. Thank you. So this is a picture of myself standing in Gorée Island, Senegal, and I'm at the Gorée Island House of Slaves, which many people call the slave castle, at the door of no return. And this place is a place where it's one of many actually slave castles or fortifications where captured and enslaved African people were held and taken away by slave ship to wherever the final destination in the Western Hemisphere is going to be, never to return. Thus, the naming of it, the door of no return. Right. Next slide. We designed within the memorial itself as a doorway to pass through something that we call the door of return, in order to reinterpret the potential of that historic experience for people of African descent and for others to return or pass through and to reclaim in some small part that lost part of that history. And in acknowledgement of that tragic experience of the Middle Passage, for people to be able to return culturally, emotionally, and psychologically, hopefully to a place where they are more whole. So we are very concerned about and interested in the opportunity for spaces and places and the previous that can heal. And I was very intrigued by the previous presentation about the nature of geometry and its capacity for it to have a healing vibration. And through this particular door of return and through other places and spaces within the burial ground, we're trying to create these kinds of geometries that are more healing. And you'll notice that there are a lot more curved lines and softer edges intersecting with some of the more rigid geometries that begin to, in my sensibility, balance the geometric energy and the geometric language of the spaces that are generated by the masculine and the feminine, the yin and the yang, right? Mm-hmm. Where you can look at the building across the street, which is this building in the 26 Federal Plaza. It has that relentless orthogonal 90-degree grid that modernism has historically been focused upon, that is devoid of, this balance that we're trying to achieve. And that's part of that formal language and that contextualism that we were looking at, not just monumental African archetypes like the pyramids that were discussed earlier, but also more, I would say, traditional archetypes which had like rounded forms that were more collective, softer. It also generated a certain type of energy and power. And then putting those together to create the kind of forms that we have. And in this particular instance, this is the door of return. Next slide, which people pass through.
Oh, beautiful.
In that image of that woman passing through that place in that space to return, hopefully, to a more holistic place and space. Next slide. Mm. And once one passes through, one comes into this lower level courtyard area, which has this series of engraved symbols around it we call the Circle of Diaspora, that is reflective of, these symbols are reflective of a series of spiritual belief systems that were carried through throughout the world and transformed in different ways and adopted in different ways by people of African descent. So you'll have symbols not only from Africa, but you have symbols from Haiti, Cuba, Brazil, and other places that talk about and are reflective of different belief systems, but they all come from a similar source. And I think that that's something that's very interesting and also reinforce an idea of passage and of the crossroads. The last symbol on the right of where that woman is standing that she's looking at is actually a Haitian Vodun symbol of Legba, which is the guardian of the crossroads, which we placed in that location to allow one to understand that you are now at a crossroads between a realm of spiritual boundary, between the spiritual realm and the living realm, between the secular space and the sacred space.
Yeah. But
and now you are in the sacred space.
Sorry, Rodney, just a quick question. Most of these symbols, of course, coming through Haiti, Cuba, Bahia, and Brazil, they're essentially Yoruba and Igbo, right? Symbols? Or is it other tribes as well in West Africa?
I mean, there are other belief systems that are coming from places like Congo, Congo is very central in terms of the cosmology of the Congo people. And most of these symbols of these crosses, even when you talk about Christianity and Christian cross, come out of that understanding of that Congo cosmology, which is a cross centered in a circle, which is reflected of 4 quadrants. And it really talks about life, death, birth, and rebirth, and the continuity of human life.
Right.
And how that energy is constantly passing from, life to death and back again. So that an acknowledgement of there being a kind of like a sacred, spiritual, intangible place and space and energy, and a physical place and space that we occupy in energy, and we have a connection to those that came before us, literally and spiritually, is what that really represents. And that manifests itself in different ways throughout different cultures. It's been transformed through Haitian Vodun worship practices, but also you see that also in Candomblé. You see it in Brazil, you see that in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and other places. But you also see it in other cultures as well. Next slide.
Ronnie, we are down to 2 minutes on our extended time. So can I request that maybe we can do 1 or 2 slides, and I want to ask you one question about what projects you're working on currently and how can people get in touch with you. So just thought I would share that. Please, back to you.
Sure. I mean, in terms of projects that we're working on that are similar in nature, as the last project we worked on together was that was a spiritual space, was the Transatlantic Slave Trade Memorial that Justin is scrolling through at the United Nations. That was built in 2015. We're currently working on a couple of other memorial design projects. One is for an enslaved African memorial in Teaneck, in New Jersey. We're also working on a project in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., called Mount Zion Cemetery, which is the oldest African-American slave cemetery in Washington, D.C. And they want to transform their place into more than just a cemetery, but they want to put a memorial on that site and also create a kind of like a cultural landscape of art for people to be able to experience. So we're working on that project as well. And we're shortlisted for a memorial in Tallahassee, for the capital of Florida. This is a Holocaust Memorial design. So we're one of 3 semifinalists on that, and hopefully, we'll hear back on that soon. And this last slide, we'll be teaching a course. This is the Black Lives Matter New York mural, a couple of blocks away from the burial ground on Foley Square. It's been renamed Black Lives Matter Boulevard. And I'm teaching a course in the spring at NYU's Wagner School of Public Policy, looking at how to transform the Lower Manhattan Civic Center area into an African historic district. And I think that a lot of the things that have been happening right now are calling out for that to happen. So this is what that last slide is representing, and that's what we're working on as well.
That's beautiful, Rodney. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your work, your research with all of us here. I mean, there are people from all over the world that are here live, and then many more who are going to see it on YouTube when we release it next week. And to get in touch with you, they go to rodneyleon.com, and they're able to get information on your work and who you are, etc. Um, I wish you all the very best, my friend, for everything that you do, because you're a pioneer, you're a trendsetter, you are a trendsetter in a positive way. You are helping with this whole contextual question. You and I have had a few lunches discussing this, and I'm just thrilled that you're receiving all the success that you are with the public projects that you're doing. So again, with all the love and all the best to you, I give my best to your family, and thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you so much, Ave, for also being a partner in all the work that we've been doing in the last couple of years together as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for the forum and opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. It's how, I mean, I guess once you been around the block a few times, what you really aspire for is not just amazing architecture that you can work on, but people that you enjoy working with, that we have some synergies as against, the synergies being mild. I like my synergies spicy, and with you, it's always been wonderful. So thank you for the opportunities, brother. And I wish you all the best again, man. Thanks for your time.